Welcome to Differentiated Understanding. What do I mean by this? Well, in a world where there is no longer a massive barrier for obtaining information, diverse knowledge and perspectives are no longer rare. What makes an insight or a way of doing things unique is differentiated understanding. Piecing together scattered information, parsing through noise and clouds, and then succinctly coming up with your own understanding of the situation, event, business, or person. That is what is truly valuable. Every episode, we bring in a special guest to talk about their unique take on a critical matter, phenomenon, or business trend. But most importantly, someone who will offer thoughtful thinking. This is your host, Grace Shao, and joining me today is Natalia Cote-Munoz, a policy strategist, writer, and International Strategy Forum Fellow, a program by Schmidt Futures that supports rising leaders at the intersection of geopolitics, technology, and public service. She has served in the U.S. State Department, leading foreign policy think tanks and crisis diplomacy roles. She's a graduate of the Harvard Kennedy School and speaks English, Spanish, Mandarin, just to name a few languages. Natalia, thank you so much for joining us today. I
So much
haven't
for
seen
having
you.
me.
Yeah, I feel like I don't think I've seen you in person since pre-COVID days. I think last time I saw you was literally like just at the start of COVID and we
Yeah,
had
just
some,
before COVID. We
yeah,
spent New Year's in Hong Kong, and that's when we got to catch up last time from like going to 2019 to 2020. So pretty crazy.
yeah. And I remember we had some hole in the wall dim sum place. It was amazing. It's great to catch up. And, for the audience, we met over 10 years ago when we were both living in Beijing, fresh out of uni not too long. And it was really fun, actually. So now Natalia's based out in DC and I'm out here in Hong Kong. Natalia, I know you've had a really fascinating career and actually really interesting upbringing. You've lived across 3 or 4 continents, right, growing up. And that's also why you speak so many languages fluently. Could you share a little bit about your upbringing and how those experiences shaped your path into foreign policy and tech? And then, we can get into a bit more of the weeds of like your writing and your work and your professional journey.
Sure. So I was born in the US. My family's from Colombia and from Spain, and I grew up mostly moving around the Americas. Like, I lived in Bolivia and Haiti, in New York City, and in Mexico City mainly growing up. And then in some other places for shorter periods of time. I spent shorter periods of time in Austria, spent shorter periods of time, like then in college in Taiwan, and then after college went to live in China for 4 years. And so, and all to make it even more confusing, I was going to French international schools. So, it was a huge mix of things. But I think this very confusing but like very eclectic sort of upbringing that, made me a third culture kid. It's, kind of terms for people like me who are kind of from a lot of different places. And I guess like you too, because you've kind of like lived across several places that in a way where you kind of like become a third culture. You're part of kind of this like third mixed culture of different things.
Like you're
But
a
I think
local, but
like
you're never a local. Like you feel comfortable
yeah,
in almost like all the places you live in because you're so adaptable, but then you're also like always kind of a bit off or like a
yeah,
bit
yeah,
different,
exactly,
right?
exactly. You're also kind of like from like this like also like a separate like third space that you kind of like create through your like experiences, and sometimes even like you can identify very well with someone who maybe grew up in completely different countries but like with a similar upbringing just because of like having that experience. So that's pretty, I don't know, it's pretty fun. But I think like one of the things that I mean, I think it's kind of natural from that upbringing that you become very interested in different countries and cultures, and like really taking advantage of the privilege you had, or like in being able to be exposed to so many different places and using that for good. So, international relations was like a pretty natural fit for, someone given that upbringing. And it's something that like I value a lot in me. And I also like to learn languages and learn about new cultures and, like go and explore and live in different places. So that all kind of influenced, this interest of mine.
Yeah, so on that, you've actually just recently, well, I guess not that recent, but you did serve in the Biden administration and, I guess you left that role a year ago. But from your perspective, how has US tech diplomacy really evolved over the past decade, especially in the context of China, I think, just a high level tech diplomacy overview?
So I mean, it's been a lot. There's been like a like very, very big change. I mean, if I remember when we lived in China, that was kind of the beginning of the end slash the end of Western tech companies really trying to make it there. I remember when I don't know if, like, when you moved there, but when I first moved there, Uber was still there, for instance, which did not last more than a few years. I know Google had been recently kicked out. You could still see the Google sign outside of, like, a building in Udalco that they used to work out of, but and it was people just referred to it as a Google building, but there was no more Google there. So, I we were kind of that was kind of like the beginning of a big transition. And we were also living through kind of the beginnings of WeChat really becoming the powerhouse super app. Like, I think towards I left China in 2016, and towards then was when you were really starting to see everybody just using WeChat Pay and QR codes to pay for everything. Whereas 4 years earlier, when I had moved to China, everything was like cash based. So I remember paying my rent in cash bills, and you had to because like the highest denomination for renminbi is not that high, right? What is it, like 200 kwai, 500 kwai?
No, it's 100. It's not like Hong Kong, you get
100,
500,000.
100
So
kwai.
you just
Oh my
get
gosh, you look.
stacks, right?
So I remember like paying rent in Beijing with stacks of 100 kwai, which is like the equivalent of a little bit more than $10, but I'd be paying, like city rent, with just stacks of hundreds of dollars every single month. And so that's a huge change from like the beginning, of like how money was treated. Um, like just at the beginning of me moving to China in 2012 and then me leaving in 2016. That like in those 4 years, those types of transactions, I mean, I don't know if they like people would still do that. I don't see cash anywhere. I've even been
Yeah.
told by friends that they had cash and they wanted to pay like a taxi or something with it. The taxi driver thought that it was like so mafan, so annoying that they had cash that they're just like, dude, just like forget about it. Just don't even pay me. I'd rather not get paid than have to deal with cash at this point. So that's kind of a very, very different, like a very different tech environment. And now like there's like since I left, there's been more of like a tech decoupling, which there's been like I think like both the US and China have contributed to. And, it's I think not necessarily completely antagonistic. I think that like China has had like in its mind an idea of creating its own tech ecosystem, and that's part of the reason it was kicking out all these different tech companies and then bolstering its own like national companies. And now we're kind of at this weird spot. I mean, I think like I'm not very clear where we are right now, but there is like I would say like now it's like a big tech competition over AI, but it seems also like the US and China have very different approaches and definitions and goals of like what they want to achieve with controlling AI. And the discourse is very, very different in both countries too. So that's something that's like newer, is just like within the past few years that's completely changed the tech environment. But so now you not only have these two like bifurcated tech systems, but you also have this like competition towards AI development and integration that in some ways is a competition. In other ways, they're also like, seeking different things and the systems are so different. So it just feels like each country is also playing its own game and they also have their own incentives and like national goals and they're different players. So it's a very interesting and dynamic and complex environment.
Yeah, you definitely touched on quite a few big themes I think we're going to unpack today. Like you said, I think when we were there, which is like 10 years ago, the tech, like domestic tech competition was largely the real reason that a lot of big tech from the West couldn't really make it because of the pricing war, right? But then like with Google and such, like their 2B businesses stayed on, but their 2C businesses were completely just kind of cut out. I think like you said, there was an effort from top down to really create its own domestic consumer internet ecosystem. And then the digital like money transformation was wild. Like exactly to your point, like when you try to pay taxi drivers or even like vendors on the streets for like a bottle of water and give them cash, you're literally just like glaring at you with like a death stare, just like get out of my face. Why are you making my life miserable with like things I have to carry? It is kind of crazy how the adoption rate is just so crazy high. Even when you go to like a fourth tier or like a village, people actually have actually this sounds so not PC, but like there was jokes, even like, when people are on the streets, there were like actual beggars literally with QR codes be like, if you want to give me money, give it to me via my WeChat wallet, which is just crazy. That like people just refuse to carry cash. Okay, I think we'll unpack like the second half of your kind of commentary, which is the AI race bit later. But just a bit of throwback to China days. You were part of Princeton Asia, and I remember you guys, like the fellows, would host these big dinners out in like this like hole in the wall, like at this place called Zhang Mama. It's like they sold like
Oh my God,
spicy
such good
skewers.
food.
It was so good, but so greasy and gross. And I think we can only handle it in our 20s. My stomach could not
Yes.
handle that now. You recently returned to Beijing for the first time in like more than 10 years, right? And you wrote about it on Substack. And that's how I actually noticed you again online. And we connected over that. It was such a great piece. It was nuanced, it was funny, it was insightful. You provided historical context, you provided personal touch. And you talked about the tech development of the city and how much it's changed over a decade, right? Tell us about that, like just like a bit of a reflection on, a big 10-year gap. Because for me, I still go like at least 3 or 4 times a year. So I don't see it as like I think obviously I think for me it was like pre-COVID and post-COVID, it was a 3-year gap that I didn't go to mainland that I really noticed new technology popping up, like in restaurants and like robot waiters and things like this. But it must have been a bigger shock for you after 10 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me it was 8 years, but still, I mean, it's basically a decade. I think I missed like the big like I was seeing like the beginning of like, the WeChatization of everything. And but I missed Mobike, for instance. So some of like the big things that are more similar to now, I like missed the key year, which I think was like 2017. So even it's interesting because I talked to some people, more some people commented or reacted to my piece who had left in 2017 and then come back sort of recently, and they didn't feel like it was as big of a change. But that's also the pace of China, right? The pace of Chinese development, where even just having missed 1 year means like such a gap in like what China like is. And one thing that was fun too, and I'm glad I did get to see the beginning of WeChat because I knew how it worked. Like I, like could figure out things even if like WeChat had new features. Like I had an intuition for it. If I had never lived through that, it would have been very, very difficult for me to like figure out even how to move around. And especially because when I went, China was still, I mean, after COVID, like China like closed up, became very, very insular. And so it was still kind of figuring out, like, getting foreigners in again, and the apps were not working for foreigners. Like, as someone who did not live there and, like, did not have, like, a bank account or a visa, everything was just not like, lots of glitches, like, had to be with, like, customer service, and thank God, like, I speak Chinese and could, like, manage kind of, like, those things too because, like, my, like, payment would never work, so stuff like that. But it was funny because when I met up with friends, they weren't sure exactly at what point I had left and if I knew what WeChat was. And so some of them were like, "Do you know how to order a cab? They'd ask me very basic questions like that. And so I'm glad I did see that, but that kind of like tells you if I had like left maybe like 2 or 3 years beforehand, I may not have had like as much of an intuition of like how deeply integrated WeChat was and like all its different features and like how it worked than I did just for leaving a few years later. Like WeChat was there from the beginning when I was there, but it definitely became like with WeChat Pay and like the level of integration with everything and the mini apps that was something that became more of a thing towards my last 2 years in Beijing. But honestly, the biggest thing that struck me was the railway system because I mean it was always impressive and like every year I was there was like a new subway line or something in Beijing, like just insane. But looking at the railway system, and one of the things that I noticed was that, I was looking at the map and cities that like I, in a previous life, may have referred to as, like a middle of nowhere or something like that. We're now on the map on this like high speed rail. And that to me was insane. And one of them, for instance, was Home, which I had visited with my friends in 2012, friends from college. And we took the like 12-hour sleeper train where you kind of share like the like six bunk room with a bunch of people, and even though it's like not that far from Beijing, but it was like a place where you can spend like a long weekend to see the grottos. And but getting there was just a whole ordeal, and it was a place that was very under construction, so it was, like, clearly, it was a place that had an ambition to, like, be something much bigger and was, like, going places, but, like, you went there and it was, like, still not there yet, and, like, the hostel we stayed in was in the middle of a mall that was kind of abandoned and had a lot of, like, old, like, Russian clothes and mannequins, and yeah, and so just seeing that place that I had, like, this experience, and to me, it was just like, this is very far away from, like, a city like Beijing. This is very far away from, like, a developed city. Now being on a high-speed rail train, that to me was a sign of, like, wow, like, things have changed. The fact that, like, Dakong is, like, now on this high-speed rail than so many different places are is a huge sign of, like, how, like, vastly this has expanded. So that was honestly, like, the most impressive to me, just seeing, like, how much that the map of the high speed rails had expanded.
And I think another social media platform that you start trying out that became a thing after you left is Red, right? You told
Yeah.
me just recently you went on Red 小红书 to gauge like the general public's attitude towards like technology and like AI development. What did you really
Mhm.
learn from the conversations and what do you make of it? Because it was quite funny. Like we had that whole like TikTok refugee phase.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, like Reddit suddenly became such a mainstream thing. Well, not mainstream, but like people knew about it outside China. But when I'm in like Greater China, people kind of see it as this like lifestyle app, but you also kind of get your like you can use it for search. But it is very, very much focused for like the metropolitan urban women, like in their 20s and
Yeah.
like millennial women, not even Gen Z, I probably say. But it just suddenly became cool. Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, it was like I had heard about it, but I didn't really know much what it was. And when I was back in Beijing last fall, I caught up with an old student who's an artist, and she highly recommended being on Rednote because like it was a basically the place to find like cool hip stuff. And she's a cool hip young adult now, and she was like, this is like the app. And I downloaded it, but like I couldn't figure it out yet, and I didn't, so I like I had it on my phone, but I wasn't, like, really paying attention to it. And then the TikTok refugee thing happened. I was like, "Ah, let me log on again and just see what this looks like." And I didn't even, like, plan, like, on participating much on it, but it was really interesting, and one of the things that I saw was that a lot of people there's, like, this feature on it where people ask, like, questions to the public, which I found interesting, and so there were a lot of and you can have them be bilingual automatically, like, they just automatically become bilingual, so you have, like, a question of, like and there would be questions from, like, Chinese people, questions from, like, Americans, and and be like, "Americans, what do you think of Red Note?" Like, Americans would ask, like, "Hey, people, what do you think about the US?" Like, and they're like, "They're banning TikTok and we're here. Like, what do you think about that?" And just, there was this, like, conversation that was really interesting to just watch and read through. So, I was doing that, and then, a few weeks later, like, I left the administration later. I mean, very like, just a couple weeks later, I left on January 20th, and so I had more time, and I, like, decided to, like, ask a couple questions, and I, like, logged out and just, like, see what happened, and, like, when you first post, everyone asks you to, like they're like, the pet tax, like, you need to, like, post a picture of your pet. That's, like, the first thing that people ask you whenever you go, and I was like, "Here are pictures of my dogs." So it was just like a very funny like app. And, as I've been writing about AI and kind of like thinking about like my like return to China last fall, which I was like I wrote about too this year. I was thinking about like what the conversation on AI is like in China because I know on Substack, especially since it's also a platform that has a lot of artists and writers, and so obviously there's like a lot of grievances in those fields surrounding AI. So a pretty negative conversation on AI. And just in general, right now, there's like a big kind of like tech lash towards AI and a big frustration with the tech industry in general in the West, and a lot of skepticism or just, or doomerism, but in general, like negative feelings in the public discourse towards AI. So I was wondering, like, like I had the feeling that, I mean, China is a different world. Like, I had a feeling it would be different, but I kind of wanted to get a sense of it myself. And so I just posted the question because I remembered how active people were and how engaged people were in like answering questions, especially like from Americans. There's always like a lot of curiosity surrounding like foreigners on the app and like foreigners asking questions and a lot of engagement. So I posted the question and like in the end there were like 80 comments. Like it was pretty insane. Like, they were pretty repetitive, like, a few, like, kind of themes that came up, but overall, it was very interesting to read and see people's reactions, and I basically asked, like, "What do you guys think about AI, like, in China, in the West?" The conversation right now is pretty negative, and I would also share some of the, like, main arguments that, like, are in the public discourse just to kind of explain what it is, whether, like, it wasn't about, like, what I thought, although I think, like, that was not always very clear to the commenters, and some of them just got, like, very heated with, like, my responses. So I was like, "Oh," like, "well, this is, like, an argument that people make." But, I mean, like, there's only so much you can, like, share when you have, like, limited character space and, like, comments. So, like, that might have, gone over people's heads. But, yeah, it was very, very techno optimistic.
What were some of the things people would say about it? Like you said, for the West, I think, especially since the Meta scandal with involved with like the elections, I think there's a lot of mistrust in tech. Over the years, we've seen a lot of people also kind of being upset about just how much wealth that these tech companies accumulated over just like 2 3 decades. There's also worries about like ethical practice, safety practice, especially revolving around children, teenagers. Like there's so many kind of main buckets that people are a bit worried about in terms of tech. But when you talk about China's tech optimism, what are kind of the main key buckets people brought up?
Yeah, I think in general, people gave a lot of examples just like, hey, this will just improve overall, like our quality of life. Like it will improve healthcare. It'll improve this. It'll make our jobs like less repetitive. Even some people were like, I'm like a designer and this like makes my workflow much faster and much more efficient. There was less of a discussion of feeling like threatened by AI. And they're like, it's still like a nascent field. It's going to develop, but, like, overall, it's, like, for the best, it's for the good of people, um, and another person, which I thought was funny, said that me asking this question was a trap because it was me, like, trying to force people to think that, like, AI was something negative and to be critiqued while we were developing AI, and so, like, it was just, like, kind of, like, hypocritical. It was just, like, a weird thing, but I just found it, like, kind of like a funny reaction, a bit conspiratorial, obviously, a lot of people saying like, no matter like what the West says, we're damned if we do, damn if we don't. Overall, we think this is good for our society. And there's also some people explicitly said that like they trusted the government to handle any issues that would arise from the development of AI, which I found interesting too, which is not something that is true in the West. There have been surveys about like people's feelings on AI and like what people responded in Red Note to me pretty much echoed kind of in general the Chinese population that was surveyed in various reports on AI attitudes shared. And whereas like the attitudes from a lot of countries in the West did not have as much confidence in like their government like dealing with AI. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So it's not something to like completely just take at face value. There's like a lot of contextual stuff to understand to fully unpack that. But there is like it is like an interesting signal.
That's just really interesting, I think, observation. I kind of want to bring our conversation to the education field because I think the whole AI conversation has also really, really zoomed in on talent and education and how the the two leaders in AI right now are China and US, and how like talent from the two uh, countries, how they're trained up are so different, but how have they become the leaders of the world, right, in this field? I guess what I want to say is you were a Princeton Asia Fellow in Beijing, and your station was actually at the Chinese Foreign Affairs University teaching international relations. Now, for context, CFAU is one of like the top universities in the country, and they do function quite differently than how we understand universities in the West, which is like either you're a really mega big school, state backed, provincial backed, or you're a private school. Many times, you have certain expertise or like leaders coming out of that field. For China, aside from the main big universities, some of the top universities are actually feeders into ministerial ministries. So for CFAU, a lot of the students actually become like a pipeline into the government institutions like the Foreign Affairs Ministry, right? And then you have like UIBE, which is like the International Business School. They feed into the Commerce Ministry. You have like the Media University. They feed into like a lot of state media. So there's kind of like these schools that are just known that if you attend them, you will be going into this industry under the state development. So can you kind of tell us what you felt like teaching at a university like that? And I guess in the sense of like, are the students really different from people universities like Tsinghua and Peking U? How are they taught differently, or how do they think differently from say like an 18, 19-year-old kid back in the US?
Sure. So, with the caveat that this was like 10 years ago, and so I taught millennials that were just a couple years younger than me. So another thing that was like special about China Foreign Affairs University is that it is part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not under the Ministry of Education, which is a particular thing, and it is known to be a big feeder school into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would say, in general, of the people who do the bachelor, the normal bachelor's degree, maybe like a third go into diplomacy or like civil servants for something foreign affairs related. And the other two thirds, similar to any international relations program, they'll do similar work. So they'll go into journalism, they'll go into NGOs, law, consulting, kind of like the range of fields that people who kind of study international affairs do. But those who do like a second bachelor's, which is this like intensive 2-year program for people who already have a bachelor's but want to like change careers, all of those really do go into the foreign ministry. So a very high percentage of the students go and become diplomats. And there are also a lot of Chinese officials who are already working who will come for like short-term English language courses. And one thing that's particular about CFAU too is that the one of the main entry requirements is a pretty high level of English and or foreign languages. So all the students were pretty fluent. If you think of, the like European like language levels, I would say most students had at least a B2 um, uh, equivalent, like advanced proficiency, or like, medium advanced proficiently, and that would be kind of the bare minimum. But those, especially those who majored in translation or English language or something more humanities related, their level of English tend to be very, very high. And so the classes that I took were, I mean, that I that I took that I was teaching weren't necessarily focused on like teaching the language itself, but practicing it. So they were conversational courses about current affairs, society, and we would discuss various issues related to international affairs. So it was interesting because it was kind of like the meeting like the Chinese versions of me, right? Like the students who like are interested in international relations and so on. Like in terms of the main differences between like an international affairs student in the US or in other countries and also like differences with like Tsinghua or like Beijing. Well, when it's much more specialized and it's much smaller, you're basically in the same class of like 20 people from like your major for all 4 years. And you're also roommates with a lot of them. So it's like a very, very tight knit small school as opposed to like a gigantic school like Tsinghua Beida. And it's very specialized and very like much more outward focused because of like English language requirement, and everybody has like foreign teachers. So I would say like compared to like Tsinghua and Beida, those would be like the main differences. And although it's a very elite school, it's like it's also in a sense kind of like a liberal arts college where like it's like pretty elite, but like not everyone knows it. You like kind of have to be in the know. So like, as opposed to, like, a Harvard or, like, a Stanford where, like, everybody knows the name, just like Beida or Tsinghua, like, it is, like, one of those schools that are, like, small that, like but if you're in the know, it's very impressive, but not everybody knows them to, like, the same extent, so not as much, like, name recognition, but still, like, very prestigious for those who know and those in the fields that are related to international affairs. Compared to like, students in I don't like, me and, like, my classmates in, the US, I think I mean, their education was much more specialized and much more focused on, like, their particular major. We had a lot more flexibility. And there's also, like, more of a push for, like, us in, like, an American, like, liberal arts system. I went to a small liberal arts college, but not I was, like, an international relations focused person, but I was not the only person doing that, but, like, there were a lot of friends who were, like their majors were, like, astrophysics and, like, interpretive dance or, like, engineering and, like, art history. It's just, like, broader mix of things, and you also only have to, like, take you don't have to take as many classes in your major as opposed to, like, almost everything being related to your major. Um, and that allows you for more flexibility to, like, have a more, like, well-rounded education, quote, unquote, as opposed to a more specialized one. Another thing that's different that I think is also, like, more related to the systems, but in the US, your senior year, um, grades really, really matter, and so that's, like, a year where you're, like, super intensely focused on, like, your grades because if you wanna go to grad school and stuff like that, like, your grades from, like, your last year will matter more, especially if you're going to grad school in something like law where they, like, take that much more into consideration. Whereas in China, the last year that you're in school, you're basically job hunting. And so your last year is supposed to be like pretty lax. And most people are doing like internships all the time and just taking a couple classes. And it's more the first years of college that are like more difficult and more intense. But your grade needs to be like good enough, but it's not supposed to be a very intensive year. And so in that sense, like the attitude of like a senior in college in China is going to be different than like a senior in college in the US just because of like those like systemic differences. But I would say there were a lot of similarities in terms of the students that are interested in international affairs related stuff. Like most of them want to join CFAU. A lot of them just like, they applied via Gaokao and it was, like they got the points and like good like language requirements. They kind of ended up there, some of them kind of randomly. But an attractive thing about it to them was, the idea of like maybe going abroad and maybe like studying different languages and like meeting people from other countries and cultures. And I think that's something that almost everyone who's interested in international relations, goes, and, like, it's if you talking to my former colleagues from the State Department, a lot of them joined the Foreign Service for similar reasons, they wanted to, like, go abroad, they, like, did Peace Corps, like, they, like, studied abroad in whatever, they did a Fulbright, and so these students were pretty similar in that sense, and a lot of them wanted to go either do like a semester abroad in the US or elsewhere or go do their master's degree abroad. So a lot of my students went to different parts of the world. Some of them even just like traveled and some of them are still abroad. And now they like live full time like in the countries that they went to study abroad in or like, maybe have moved since then but are still like have left China, like a big portion of them. And so in that sense, it's like pretty similar, in terms of just like the broader like interests. And of course, yeah, like the educational like culture and system is different, but like ultimately, like what attracts people into this route is very similar across the board.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you brought up the fact that like CFE you had a lot more foreign teachers, and I think it really is dependent on the industry or like the sector you're in. Because I did exchange at Tsinghua of economics management, and actually I would say majority of the teachers were also like if they're not returning Chinese, they were like foreigners, and they all taught at like international institutions like in Germany and in the U.S. whatnot. So like there definitely is a pretty strong, I guess, embrace or encouragement to have international faculty at these like elite schools in China. So exposure to international, I guess, talent per se or thinking is not as rare as what a lot of the Western people might think it is. That said, I also agree with you on the observation where education felt like it was a lot more, I wouldn't say vocational, but like you said, more specialized. Like you don't really go to university to explore yourself. You're supposed to go in and just like hone in on that subject you pick and then like find a job. It's very pragmatic. And it really, that mentality, it just kind of goes through transcends like through everything that the Chinese people do, whether it's building AI apps or like, finding jobs, whatnot, which we'll go into a bit later. But I did want to kind of double click on one thing you mentioned. You said that despite what drives people innately is quite similar, the education system can be a bit different. And, right now there's studies saying nearly 30-40% of undergraduates in China are studying STEM related, or even more higher percentage of that. And I don't know if you read the recent Dan Wang book, Breakneck, but he was saying, his whole argument is China's run by engineers, the US run by lawyers. And we see that in the like political system. We see that in the leaders of a lot of companies like Fortune 500s that are do you see this difference in mindset and training when you were teaching in China or when you're engaging with people like that people kind of not worship STEM, but just saw STEM as like a better way to secure pragmatic gains in the future? Because there is that saying like 好什么数理化走遍
Mhm.
how do you say it again? 走遍天下, right? Like you study biology, physics, math, whatever, and then you can do anything you want in the world. Essentially, is the premise of that saying, and it's a very common saying amongst the older folks. So, yeah, just wanted to hear your thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think because of where I taught, it was in a school that, like there were like economics students and, like there were math classes because of that. But it was a school that was very much like social sciences and humanities, very like liberal arts in that sense. Like, even though people were much more specialized, it wasn't a STEM school. And that's not what the students were pursuing. So there was like less of a feel of that in that school because, like, not, I mean, these weren't the students that were doing that. But I would say that beforehand, I did spend a year doing college consulting. So I advised students who were at the high school level in China to apply to universities abroad, mainly in the US. And there I did feel that much more from the parents, where like people, like the parents especially, would be pushing their kids to go to certain universities either because of rank or because like of a certain like program that was usually STEM related. Sometimes even if like the kid had zero interest in that, and sometimes like I would see the fights real time and like very awkwardly between like parents and kids on like and also explaining to the parents that like they didn't have to in like most universities in the US, unless you go to like certain programs or like a very specialized university, which also exists. But in most of them, like you don't have to pick your major right away. So that didn't matter, but, like, explaining that was a whole thing, and also saying, like, "Hey, like, you can go to basically any school and, like, have that major, like, it's not, like, a huge deal," that was definitely very present. In the US, like, I would say, like, especially, I would say maybe the generation after I graduated college, comp sci became a huge like the most popular major of all. So suddenly there were way more software engineers virtually in every university than there were when I was going to college. When I was going to college, it was a tiny major that was like, very niche and very specific for nerds. And there were way more people doing law, but I think like the Zillennials and Gen Z, like software engineer is probably the most popular major. So you also do see that. Although I don't know if it's necessarily comes from like as much of like a respect or like adoration of the sciences as much as something more pragmatic, which is that the tech sector was booming. And it was, it's like tech jobs are, I mean, like competitive, but computer science is ultimately something like pretty learnable that like a lot of people could do and could like assure you like a good life, or at least that was kind of like the idea that a lot of people have. Now with AI, things are being upended a little bit, but I think that's a big, big thing. I would also say that part of it too, I think like a Chinese education at the high school, middle school, like elementary level has a much stronger focus on sciences than in the US. It's hard to like because like in the US like everything is state based, but because also it's not as centralized of an education system, there are much more gaps in the sciences than I would say in China. And like China has consistently scored higher on science subjects.
Yeah, I would just say I think that leads us to the next point. Like there was definitely that generation where everyone wanted to become a computer scientist, like a programmer, and that was the kind of like golden ticket to a very high paying job without sometimes not that busy, right? Like it was like a really good
Yeah.
ROI.
Yeah.
And some of the smartest kids went into that industry. Now that's being completely disrupted by AI, and it'll be interesting to see kind of the next generation, like or even the kids now entering university, where
Yeah.
that would go and lead to. So I think on that note, actually, I want to talk about the relationship between AI, productivity, creativity. I think you first wrote a story on a post on Substack talking about how you learn how to use AI tools. You wanted to explore AI as a productivity partner. Can you kind of share that and how that's really changed your mentality around AI and productivity and creativity? Because you did start the conversation saying a lot of your peers in the creative field are very against AI. How has that changed and shifted your thoughts on AI?
Sure. So, I mean, I was curious about AI and I was experimenting with it, but it was still very casual. And I mean, I found like some like useful things in it, but I think it wasn't until I was kind of like in a point where I felt very limited that I felt like maybe this is like a good thing to experiment with more. So basically, I got a concussion, and the way that that affected me was that I had really bad migraines, and I couldn't really look at screens for long periods of time for a few weeks because just the brightness would like give me really bad headaches. And so like I still like needed to write regularly, and so that was pretty difficult, and so I tried to think of workflows that would make that more manageable. So I started with, like, a voice first workflow, and, what I started doing was basically speaking at my phone, doing a voice memo, and kind of like vomiting out everything that I wanted to write and then giving like very specific instructions of like to the AI is like, okay, then I would take like the transcript and be like, okay, so this is a transcript. This is what I want to argue. Turn this into prose, but keep my voice and organize it this way. And then it would like vomit something out, basically reorganizing what I had given it, and then I'd give it, like, also intensive feedback via voice, and that way I didn't have to spend as much time, like, looking at the screen. 'Cause usually, like, it's easier to just for me to just write things out, but that was just not something I was able to do without, like, really being in pain, and with that I mean, that taught me a lot of things, like, one is just kind of, like, the potential of AI. I think, like, the thing with LLMs is that the way that I think of them is that they're kind of like Play-Doh, that they're very fungible and you can kinda, like, mix them together, but unless, like, you're very deliberate, just like with Play-Doh, you're going to end up with, like, this, like, horrible mix of, like, a ton of, like, ugly colors that ends up just being a weird brown as opposed to, like, the very beautiful, like, Play-Doh, like, models you see in the pictures. So you need to just kind of, like, be very, like, deliberate, but, like, once you learn how to do it, you can find, like, that there's a lot of potential with it.
Challenges our idea of authorship and creativity, because I know, like, a lot of creative people are saying it's essentially brain rot. There's AI slop.
Yeah.
I'm not even going into copyright issues, but just in terms of like our actual thinking process, do you think it's making us dumber or less creative?
I It really depends on how you use it, and so I think a lot of it ends up being part with, like, really about, 1, AI literacy and understanding what it can and can't do, And also, it really just depends on how you use, like, when I was using AI in this way, I would sometimes talk, like, for hours. Like, it was, like, hours and hours of material that, like, came from me, and, like, the AI, like, put it together on, like, a page on the internet and, like, but with a lot of my guidance and with all of my arguments and, like, some assistance. So, it was still me even though it was assisted. And I think there's this misconception that any sort of AI assistance with writing, especially, is just like you basically put in a prompt like, write me an article about this, and it just vomits something out. And that does happen. And you do see it sometimes. I don't think it happens as much as people think because honestly, like when you try that, like it's pretty like generic. It's just like not the like it's what
The quality's
AI
not good.
produce.
It doesn't
Yeah,
sound
the
like a
quality's not
human
good.
anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, the way I kind of explain it is that, like, LLMs are like, like a McKinsey intern or something. Like, they're generalists. They, like, know how to make a pretty presentation, like, they can, like, talk the talk and BS a bit and, like, sound convincing, but, like, you scratch the surface and it's all, like, it's not there yet, and, like, clearly, like, they don't know their stuff, right? So, it's really, like, a very, like, junior level management consulting. They know how to like put together something that like sounds right, but it's not. And it doesn't necessarily have a good quality. It might be better quality than some people's writing, which is a whole issue unto itself on just like the level of education that people have. Yeah. So in general, like ChatGPT is not enough. What worries me more is that some people think it is. And then it's more just like the decisions that people make up top and just like replacing people with it because they don't have either the knowledge or really care enough, and are willing more to like think about their bottom line. I think that's an issue. In terms of education, I do worry because I mean, no, we still really haven't figured out kind of like AI and ethics. I think we're in just like a very unfortunate transition phase where everybody is a guinea pig. I think we're going to figure it out eventually and like using AI, people are going to, like get smarter on this. It's going to be obvious if something is just like not like good quality. Honestly, like I don't super care if you used AI for assistance. I mean, part of me, based on my experience, like, I don't know why you're using AI for assistance. Like, if you have a disability, if you're like, like you like use different things, like there are things that like might sound like ChatGPT, and I have friends who they use that to help them write, but it's not necessarily like ChatGPT's ideas. It's just like it's hard for them to write because they might have dyslexia or they might have,
Whether ESL, like it's not their first language,
yeah,
like
yeah.
yeah.
So
I
there
use it
could
a
be a
lot
lot of
for
reasons.
translating Chinese word into English. It makes it easier for me to read, right?
Yeah,
But I completely get your point. It's a lot of it is actually the sophistication of using it right now is how you prompt it and how you actually feed your thinking and guide it. But that might change. And right now we're all guinea pigs, just such early stage
yeah,
of it all. But actually on that note, I wanted to ask, like, so going back to kind of the policy side of work that you've done and like majority of your career has been built around that. Do you think, the whole like productivity partner for individuals angle can use in diplomacy? Like, could AI agents now one day be trusted to negotiate or even draft foreign policy briefs? Like, do you see that kind of playing out in governments?
diplomacy a lot about is about relationships, and it's about reading the room and being able to like build like a strong relationship, and like represent like interests and your country and so on. And AI can't really do that on its own. Like an AI is not going to be able to like garner that level of like trust and intimacy for like diplomacy. Like I can see it like garnering like trust and intimacy as a sort of like, like companion in some things, but that's like very different, right? That's more like, like it's like an emotional assistance. But in terms of as a peer, like AI cannot be your peer because it does not have the same like capabilities, and ultimately the human element is just so important in anything that is diplomacy related, anything that involves with like the provision of services, which is what government is. And another element related to that is that you need to use a lot of contextual judgment when you make decisions in government because there's a lot of imperfect decisions, but you need to do stuff to that like help people in the best way according to like the values and constraints that you have. And those are calls that are very, very difficult to make for an AI that does not have context and does not like understand humanity. It can like make it seem like it understands context, but it does not understand context. And anyone who spends enough time with an AI, like, it's obvious. And so I don't think that AI can replace almost like, I think maybe some very, very technical administrative roles. I can see that, but anything that involves making decisions on people and or engaging with people, which is a lot of government work, I can't see that, in the same way that like I've used AI writing assistants. Like I can see that too.
I think it can definitely be more implemented beyond what you're saying, just the writing aspect. Like a lot of it is also like check and balances, checking like, you can keep track of like a database of checking like arguments and etc. Like there are other ways of using it, but I do see your point when it comes to actually like replacing a human, it's impossible because so much of the decision is it's first of all so sensitive. A decision can have such a big trickle effect, but it's based on the context, history, culture, nuances that it cannot be picked up. Just sometimes kind of not explainable, right? Like human, even like how your eyes flickered or whatever in a meeting, like that could indicate something, right? And that's just like the humanity of us, and that can't be replaced by a machine. I think mindful time. I want to kind of go into the last bit, which is actually sorry before that. When it comes to legitimacy in AI, do you think it will matter who builds it, like the system? In this case, the leaders are the US, China, and Europe as a whole, and how they are used by global citizens? Or do you think the technology itself is more important and, like it doesn't really matter who are the creators or developers of the technology?
I mean, I think it depends what level and like type of AI that we're building, but I would say for most AI use cases, the technology itself is something that once developed is pretty learnable to use and localize and indigenize. And I think that would be like the best way forward for most AI uses. So just like you take this technology that's been developed and then like make it specific to your own context. And I think that's something that is not as hard as people think and that a lot of people are doing. So I can see a future where just like people take the technology and just like localize it. Of course, like that is something that's like against people's like bottom lines or like like maybe like national interest or whatever, but I think for like a lot and maybe like most like regular run of the mill like AI use cases, that's something that is completely doable. Now for certain types of technology that could be like more powerful, more sensitive, more like difficult, I don't know, like if we think like AGI level, it's hard to say because a lot of this is so speculative, but, like, in theory, like, I can see, like, certain technologies being, like, very dangerous and, like, ideally, there are some actors that, like, ideally would not have them. Like, imagine just the same way, like, we think about nuclear weapons. Imagine if, like, a violent non-state actor, like, had a nuke and decided to just, like, start, like, nuking countries. Like, I think the same way if you think of, like the AGI like scenario where you have a technology that's like very, very powerful and like potentially dangerous or, risky in some way. I'm personally like not super convinced we're close to AGI. Is it possible? I think like it is possible maybe in our lifetime. But I don't also like there's so many different definitions of AGI and like so it's also hard to say, but I mean, I can see in theory either AGI or at least like something like an AI technology that is like powerful and risky enough that that would matter a little bit more. But for stuff that's like, you know, a specialized LLM or like a specialized like, I don't know, basically machine learning, whatever, to like help traffic lights be more efficient or to, like have like a contextualized reviewer of court documents for like very specific things that can identify like what is just like a traffic thing that it can handle on its own versus something it needs to like give to a human, stuff like that. I think that's something that who creates the technology might matter a little bit less. course, in the end, it also just depends on the details, the implementation, if there are, like, backdoors, but I feel like a lot of that technology can just be adapted and not necessarily, like, needs to be, like, received from someone.
No, I totally see what you mean. I think it really right now it's all too speculative, and like you said, any technology or any kind of superpower per se could be dangerous if it's in the hands of bad actors, and we need like check and balances right everywhere. Okay, to wrap up, I do want to ask a question that I ask everyone. What is a belief that you hold that others might find unconventional or contrarian? This could be something serious about, like foreign policy and your expertise, or it could be something lighter about culture or something that you hold dear to in your life.
So, I would say that think that people, especially right now, like in the Western discourse, I don't know like how people are talking about it in China or people are talking about it in the same way, but or in other parts of the world. But the negativity towards labubus is like very, very, very exaggerated. And I think on a lot of ways. But what strikes me the most is a lot of discussion surrounding like adults having labubus, calling them as if like they had like, like psychological problems because they're like wearing something that's childish, which is something that's like very like well, it's problematic in a lot of different ways, but I find it especially interesting having lived in Asia where childishness is not interpreted in the same way, and it's not seen as something, or at least like this type of like childishness where you just like decorate yourself with like something childish is not necessarily seen as something that's like, so derogatory or like unprofessional. I mean, like when I worked in China, like people like it was very common, even people who are, like, senior to me to, like, have, like, cutesy accessories and have, like, cutesy notebooks, and I'm pretty sure that's pretty common throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia, and it's not necessarily seen as something that's like, "Oh, like, this person is, like has, like, psychological issues because they have it." It's just seen as, like, "Oh, this is just, like, a cute aesthetic," and you're just, like, decorating yourself or, like, appreciating this cute aesthetic and just, like, bringing this cute aesthetic to the office just like you would, like, a nice little accessory of any type. So that I find just, like, ridiculous and also, like, very, very very narrow-minded and it's, like, very toxic, like, Western pathologizing sense that yeah. So that's, I guess,
That's
a
your
hot take.
unconventional view. All right. That's your hot take of the
Yeah.
day. I think it's hilarious. You're the second guest that's brought up Labubus. I feel like an old lady because I like just so not like involved in Labubu conversation. I went to a friend's house and they had all these Labubus lying around. I was just like, oh, like what is fluffy thing? And they're just like, do you live under a rock? I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I just didn't realize it was such a big deal. And then obviously then everyone started like writing about it, even in mainstream media, about all these celebrities carrying them. It's funny how these things pop up. But like I even remember like an acquaintance of mine joined Pop Mart, I think maybe 5, 6 years ago, running their PR department. I was like, oh, what is this thing? And they went public. It was a huge actually like IPO in Hong Kong. I was like, I don't really get the business model of it, but sure. Anyway, I'm glad other people appreciate. I don't love it or hate it. I just think it's hilarious. It's a thing because I'm still living in my Hello Kitty like cinnamon roll and like Chromie stage. I'm like last generation.
It's the same concept, right? It's just like it is like, it's not weird if you like have like a Hello Kitty notebook or a keychain. It doesn't mean that you're
Yeah,
like less of a human just because you're an adult that like has that. And that's like an
yeah,
argument that like you're seeing a lot now. Also because like people I guess, like, like, trinket culture and, like, cutesy culture that's been very popular in East Asia for a while is only
yeah, yeah.
now starting to enter the mainstream in the West, and, like, I think it's definitely much more accepted now than it used to be, especially with Gen Z, but, like, these conversations are so ridiculous, like, I can understand kind of the, like, the wastefulness arguments, the whatever, but the, like, you
But
are,
we had
like
TY babies when we were growing up for millennials. I had a huge collection of TY babies. It's not like they were that
yeah,
useful, right? And I
yeah,
see your point. It's really just culturally, like, it's so different. Like in East Asia, whether it's Korea, Japan, or like, China, you see people with like gadgets on their phones all the time. You have like you said, adults using like Hello Kitty pens. Like no one really even like think about it. It's just like part of the
Yeah.
aesthetics. Like I think the minimalist aesthetics embraced by some, but not everyone out here. And the idea of what is considered professional versus not is also a bit different. Like what you talk about at work. Like I think in Asia, the work culture is also a lot more. The blurred line between professional life and personal life is a lot less. Oh, sorry, less rigid. So you can talk about like your family, your spouse, your boyfriend, girlfriend, your kids a lot more. I think in the West, it's been a bit more stifled, where it's like these are topics you don't talk about. This is how you present yourself. You are black, white, and gray and navy to work, right? Like it's a very different kind of culture. But that's super fun. Again, Tal, it's great catching up with you. It's been a
Yeah.
while. Hope to see you
Thanks for
soon.
having
If
me.
you're out in Hong Kong, let me know and I'll ping you when I'm on the East Coast next time. I think last time I was in New York, I tried to ping you, but you were out in DC, so I couldn't catch you. But it's lovely seeing old friends.
Yeah.
Thanks
Hope
again.
to see you soon somewhere in the world.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
If you enjoyed this conversation and found it insightful, please follow and subscribe to Differentiate Understanding on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Grace Shao, and thank you so much for listening. And I'll be so grateful if you shared an episode with a friend.